The red dust of Ouagadougou swirled like ancestral spirits around Amara's feet as she walked through the rude Woko market. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, "Child of two worlds, remember, the earth speaks to those who listen." But today the earth seemed to scream. 25 massive construction sites dotted the horizon like metal beasts awakening from ancient slumber. Cranes stretched their necks toward the sky, and the rumble of machinery had replaced the morning call of the weaver birds. Amara Kaboré. She turned to see Musa, her childhood friend, running toward her with a government envelope clutched in his sweating palm. His breathing was labored, not from the run but from fear. "They want you at the ministry," he gasped in more, then switched to French. "The Development Council. Now." Amara's stomach clenched. As the lead cultural preservation officer for Burkina Faso, she had been dreading this moment. The 25 megaprojects, railways, mining operations, airports, solar farms and industrial complexes, promised to transform their landlocked nation into the Singapore of West Africa. But at what cost? She took the envelope with steady hands, though her heart hammered like drums at a funeral ceremony. The paper was thick, expensive, imported. Even the stationery spoke of foreign influence. "What do your ancestors whisper to you?" Musa asked, reverting to their childhood ritual of seeking spiritual guidance before important decisions. Amara closed her eyes and felt the weight of her great-grandmother's silver bracelet on her wrist, 7 cowrie shells representing the 7 generations of wisdom that flowed through her blood. The spirits were restless. "They speak of crossroads," she whispered. "Of choices that echo through time." The ministry building stood like a concrete monument to modernization, its glass facade reflecting the traditional mud brick houses that still dotted the city. Inside, the air conditioning hummed with artificial coolness that made Amara shiver despite the 40-degree heat outside. Minister François Ouedraogo sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, flanked by men in expensive suits, some black, some white, all wearing the same expression of barely contained impatience. Maps covered the walls, marked with red pins and yellow construction zones that looked like wounds on the body of their homeland. "Ah, Miss Kaboré," the minister said in French, not bothering to stand. "Please sit." Amara remained standing. "I prefer to hear standing, minister. As my ancestors did when receiving news of war." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Dr. Heinrich Müller, the German development advisor, cleared his throat. "Miss Kaboré, we understand your concerns about cultural preservation. But surely you see the greater good these projects represent? Jobs for thousands, infrastructure that will connect Burkina Faso to global markets, renewable energy that will power our future." "Our future?" Amara's voice carried the rhythm of traditional oratory, rising and falling like the ancient griots who preserved their people's stories. "Tell me, Dr. Müller, how many of your planners speak more? Diola? Fulfulda? How can you plan our future when you cannot speak of our present?" Minister Ouedraogo leaned forward. "Amara, you've been selected to lead the Cultural Integration Committee for all 25 projects. This is an honor. This is a burial shroud dressed as a celebration cloth." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of construction machinery. Amara could feel her grandmother's presence, could almost smell the shea butter and sacred herbs that had perfumed the old woman's embrace. "The Sankara Railway will cut through the ancestral burial ground of the Gurunsi people," she continued, her voice gaining power. "The Kaya Solar Farm will displace 3 villages where the elders still speak to the spirits of the land. The Bobo de Olasso Industrial Zone will pollute the sacred waters where my great-grandmother taught me to listen to the voices of the ancestors." Chen Wei, the Chinese infrastructure coordinator, spread his hands diplomatically. "Miss Kaboré, we can relocate the burial sites. Modern technology allows us to preserve what matters while building for tomorrow." "Relocate?" Amara's laughter was sharp as a cola nut shell. "You speak of our ancestors as if they were furniture to be rearranged. Tell me, Mr. Chin, if someone wanted to move your grandmother's grave to build a shopping mall, would you call that progress?" That evening, Amara sat beneath the great baobab tree in her family compound, its massive trunk scarred by centuries of seasons. Her grandmother, Noaga, emerged from the house carrying 2 calabashes of dolo, the traditional millet beer. "The spirits are agitated tonight," the old woman said, settling beside her granddaughter. Her voice carried the musical cadence of pure Moor, untainted by colonial languages. "They speak of great changes coming like the winds before the rains. Grandmama, they want me to help them destroy everything you taught me to protect." Noaga's weathered hands found Amara's face, fingers tracing the ritual scars that marked her as a daughter of the earth spirits. Child, listen carefully. When the colonizers came with their roads and railways, they brought iron and fire. But they also brought hunger for what we possessed. Our gold, our people, our sacred knowledge. These new colonizers wear different faces but carry the same hunger. But the jobs, grandmama. The hospitals they promise. The schools. And what language will they teach in these schools? What stories will they tell? What gods will they worship? The old woman's eyes gleamed like stars in the gathering darkness. Remember the story of Yanenga, the warrior princess who founded our people. When faced with forced marriage to a man she did not choose, did she submit for the promise of comfort? Amara knew the story by heart, how Princess Yanenga had escaped on her stallion, riding into the wilderness where she met and married a hunter, founding the Mossy Kingdoms. It was a tale of choosing dignity over security, freedom over comfort. She rode into the unknown rather than betray her spirit, Amara whispered. And from her courage, a nation was born. Noaga stood, her joints creaking like old wood. The choice is yours, granddaughter. But remember, when the baobab falls, even the earth trembles. 3 days later, Amara stood before the first project site, the proposed Sankara railway terminal that would connect Burkina Faso to the Atlantic coast through neighboring countries. Named after Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader who had dreamed of African self-reliance, the irony was as bitter as traditional medicine. The ancient burial ground lay directly in the path of the proposed tracks. Stone markers, worn smooth by centuries of weather, marked the resting places of chiefs and spiritual leaders dating back to the days before the first Europeans had set foot on African soil. "You cannot be here," said James Morrison, the British site supervisor, approaching with 2 security guards. "This is a restricted construction zone." "I am where I belong," Amara replied, kneeling beside one of the grave markers. She began to speak in Moor, her voice carrying across the morning air like incense smoke. She was calling to the ancestors, asking for their strength and guidance. Other voices joined hers. Musa had arrived with elders from the surrounding villages, old men and women whose faces were maps of hard-lived lives, whose voices still carried the pure rhythms of languages that had survived slavery, colonization, and cultural suppression. "What is she doing?" Morrison asked his translator nervously. "She speaks to the dead," the young man replied. "She asks them to protect their resting place." More people arrived throughout the morning. Market women setting down their baskets of grain and vegetables, young men abandoning their motorcycle taxis, students walking out of university lectures. They came not in anger but in sorrow, mourning what was about to be lost. By noon, hundreds of people formed a human chain around the burial ground. They sang the old songs, work songs that had sustained their ancestors through the hardest seasons, praise songs that honored the spirits of the land, warrior songs that reminded them of their strength. The construction equipment sat idle, operators uncertain how to proceed. The police arrived but made no move to disperse the crowd. These were not protesters but mourners, and even the most hardened officer understood the sacred nature of what was happening. That evening, Amara returned to the ministry building for an emergency meeting. The conference room was darker now, lit only by harsh fluorescent lights that cast stark shadows on the faces gathered around the table. "Miss Kaboré," Minister Ouedraogo's voice was strained, "your actions today have caused significant complications. We have contractual obligations to our development partners." "Our development partners?" Amara's voice cut through his words like a farmer's blade through stubborn soil. "Tell me, Minister, who signed these contracts? Who negotiated these terms? And what did we receive in exchange for selling our sacred grounds?" Dr. Muller consulted his tablet. "The economic projections are quite clear. These 25 projects will increase Burkina Faso's GDP by 30% over the next decade. The railway alone will create 12,000 jobs." "Jobs for whom?" Amara stood, her hands planted firmly on the table. "How many of those 12,000 workers will speak our languages? How many will understand that the land they're reshaping has been sacred to our people for 1,000 years?" Chen Wei leaned forward diplomatically. "Miss Kaboré, we respect your cultural concerns. Perhaps we can modify the railway route slightly, create a cultural museum to preserve the history of the area." "A museum?" Amara's laughter was bitter as desert winds. "You want to put our ancestors behind glass like artifacts, charge admission for people to see what you've destroyed?" The silence stretched until Minister Ouedraogo cleared his throat. "Amara, I'm going to be direct with you. The projects move forward with or without your cooperation. You can be part of the solution, help us minimize cultural impact while maximizing economic benefit, or Or you can be replaced by someone more pragmatic. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Amara felt the weight of her ancestors' expectations, the pull of practical necessity, the fear of being cast aside while others made decisions that would shape her homeland's future. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "You have until tomorrow morning," the minister replied. The bulldozers arrive at dawn. That night, Amara walked through the old quarter of Ouagadougou, past the Grande Mosque with its distinctive Sudano-Sahelian architecture, past the traditional compounds where extended families still live together in harmony with ancient rhythms. The city hummed with the energy of old and new, motorcycle taxis weaving between donkey carts, cell phone conversations mixing with the sound of traditional drums from a nearby ceremony. She found herself at the sacred grove, a small patch of ancient trees in the heart of the city that had somehow survived decades of urban development. Local tradition said it was where the spirits of the land still dwelled, where important decisions should be made. Musa was waiting for her, along with her grandmother and 3 village elders she recognized from the morning's gathering. "The ancestors have been speaking," said Elder Tiendra Biego, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through independence, coups and countless seasons of drought and abundance. "They show us 2 paths." He drew patterns in the dust with a stick worn smooth by decades of use. "The first path, cooperation with these foreign builders. We save what we can, compromise where we must, hope that something of our essence survives in the new world they're creating." "And the second path?" Amara asked, though she already knew. "Resistance," said Elder Sorgo, the oldest among them. "Complete resistance. No compromise with those who would treat our sacred places like commodities to be bought and sold." "But the cost," Amara began. "The cost of resistance is known," Elder Tiendra Biego interrupted. "We may lose the economic benefits they promise. We may be labeled as obstacles to progress. We may watch as other nations surge ahead while we cling to old ways." "And the cost of cooperation?" "Unknown," Elder Sorgo said simply. "But history teaches us that when we compromise our sacred principles for economic promises, we lose something that cannot be recovered." Amara's grandmother had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now she spoke. "There is a third path, granddaughter. The path of Yanenga." "I don't understand." Yanenga did not simply resist or submit. She created something new. She took the wisdom of her people and the strength of her spirit and forged a new kingdom. Noaga's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. "What if we could do the same? What if we could take control of our own development on our own terms?" Dawn was breaking over Ouagadougou as Amara arrived at the railway construction site. The bulldozers were already there, their yellow metal gleaming like giant insects in the early light. Workers milled about, waiting for orders to begin. But something was different. The crowd from yesterday had grown. What had been hundreds was now thousands. People from across the region who had traveled through the night to stand with their ancestors. And they were not alone. Dr. Kwame Asante, the prominent Ghanaian development economist, stood at the edge of the burial ground with a team of journalists and international observers. Professor Sarah Nakamura from Tokyo University was setting up recording equipment to document the traditional songs and ceremonies. Representatives from the African Union, the UN Cultural Organization, and human rights groups had arrived overnight. "Miss Kaboré," James Morrison approached her nervously. "We have orders to proceed, but the international attention. Perhaps we should wait for further instructions from the capital?" Amara looked past him to where Dr. Muller and Chen Wei stood in heated discussion with men in expensive suits she didn't recognize. Investors probably, or executives from the multinational corporations funding the projects. "Mr. Morrison," she said calmly, "let me ask you something. You have children?" The question seemed to surprise him. "Yes, 2 daughters back in Manchester." "And if someone wanted to build a shopping center where your daughter's school stood, what would you do?" His face reddened slightly. That's different. This is economic development, not." "This is our school," Amara interrupted, gesturing to the burial ground. "For 1,000 years, our children have learned here who they are, where they come from, and what it means to be human. You want to tear down our school to build a railway that will make foreign companies rich while our people remain poor." The crowd began to move, not in anger but in ceremony. The elders led them in a traditional dance of mourning, their feet raising dust from the same earth that held their ancestors' bones. The sound of their voices, singing in languages older than any European colony, carried across the construction site like wind across water. Dr. Asante approached Amara with his recorder running. "Miss Kaboré, can you explain to our international audience what's at stake here?" Amara looked directly into the camera, her voice carrying the rhythm and power of the griots who had preserved their people's stories through centuries of oppression. What's at stake is the soul of Africa. For 500 years, others have told us who we should be, how we should develop, what progress should look like. They came with Bibles and guns, then with loans and development plans, now with investment packages and modernization projects. But always, the message is the same, that what we are is not enough, that what we have built over centuries of wisdom is worthless compared to what they can give us. The camera captured the sacred grove behind her, the ancient burial markers, the faces of people whose ancestors had survived slavery, colonization, and every attempt to erase their identity. These 25 projects promise to transform Burkina Faso into something new. But at what cost? When we are done transforming, will we still be Burkinabe? Will our children know the songs of their grandmothers? Will they speak to their ancestors or only to foreign investors? The morning sun climbed higher as more media attention focused on the standoff. Social media carried the story across the world. Hashtag Save Burkina Faso, hashtag Ancestral Rights, hashtag African Sovereignty. International pressure began to mount. But it was a phone call that changed everything. Minister Ouedraogo arrived at the site mid-morning, his face grim. He spoke briefly with the foreign advisors, then approached Amara. "We need to talk," he said simply. "Privately." They walked to a quiet corner of the site, away from the cameras and crowds. The minister looked older than his years, worn down by forces larger than any individual. "Amara, I'm going to tell you something that cannot leave this conversation," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "These projects, they're not what they seem." Her heart clenched. "What do you mean?" "The railway, the mining operations, the industrial zones, they're designed to extract, not to develop. The Chinese company gets mineral rights for 50 years. The German solar farm sends 70% of its energy to European markets. The industrial zones are tax-free for foreign corporations but create almost no permanent jobs for our people." The words hit her like physical blows. Then why? Because the alternative was worse. Economic sanctions, IMF pressure, isolation from global markets. They made it clear that we could accept development on their terms or watch our economy collapse entirely. Amara stared at him, understanding dawning like a terrible sunrise. "We're still a colony. We never stopped being one. We just changed the color of the flags." The minister's confession hung between them like a funeral shroud. Around them, the ceremony continued, people singing songs of resistance and dignity while foreign bulldozers waited to destroy what had sustained them for generations. But what if? Amara's mind raced, remembering her grandmother's words about Yanenga's third path. What if we refused both options? What if we created our own development model? Minister Ouedraogo laughed bitterly. With what resources? What expertise? What international support? With what we have. Her voice grew stronger as the idea crystallized. With our people. Our knowledge. Our land. Our dignity. By afternoon, the burial ground had become the center of an international incident. News crews from BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and African media outlets surrounded the site. The hashtag Ancestral standoff was trending globally. But Amara was no longer focused on the media attention. She was making phone calls. Dr. Asante had given her contacts throughout Africa. Economists, engineers, cultural leaders, and politicians who had been working for years on alternative development models. Professor Nakamura connected her with Japanese experts in sustainable technology. Even some European allies emerged, scholars and activists who understood that true development must respect cultural sovereignty. Miss Kaboré, Chinwe approached her as she finished a video call with a Pan-African development collective. "Perhaps we can reach a compromise. What if we modified the railway route, created cultural preservation zones, established a fund for traditional arts?" "Mr. Chin," Amara interrupted, "let me tell you a story. There once was a farmer whose land was covered by a wealthy merchant. The merchant offered to buy half the land for a good price, promising that the farmer could keep the other half and prosper. But the farmer knew that once the merchant controlled half his land, he would find ways to take the rest. So the farmer said no. He found other farmers, and together they created a cooperative that kept their land in their own hands while still prospering." Chen Wei's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but his eyes showed understanding. "We are no longer interested in compromise," Amara continued. "We are interested in control. Of our land, our resources, our future. And how exactly do you propose to achieve that?" Amara smiled, feeling her ancestors' strength flowing through her like river water. By remembering that we are not powerless. By remembering that dignity is not for sale. That evening something unprecedented happened. Leaders from across West Africa began arriving in Ouagadougou. Dr. Adjoa Mensah from Ghana, Engineer Mamadou Tall from Senegal, Professor Fatima Al-Rashid from Morocco, and dozens of others, African intellectuals, business leaders and politicians who had been waiting for exactly this moment. They gathered not in a government building or hotel conference room, but in the sacred grove, beneath the ancient trees where Amara had sought guidance the night before. Brothers and sisters, Dr. Mensah began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting economic colonization. What we see happening in Burkina Faso is happening across our continent. Foreign powers offering development packages that enrich them while leaving us dependent and dispossessed. But what is the alternative? Asked Minister Ouedraogo, who had been quietly invited to witness this unprecedented gathering. We need infrastructure, technology, capital investment. We need African infrastructure, developed by African expertise, financed by African resources, Professor Al-Rashid interrupted. Morocco has been developing solar technology for 20 years. Nigeria has oil wealth that could finance continental development. South Africa has mining expertise. Ghana has economic stability. What if we pooled our resources instead of selling them separately to the highest bidder? Engineer Tall spread maps across a blanket laid on the ground. The railway they want to build through your burial ground? What if we designed our own railway? One that connects African cities to each other instead of just connecting our resources to European ports. The conversation continued deep into the night, fueled by passion and decades of frustrated dreams. They spoke of an African development bank that would actually serve African interests, of technology transfers that built local expertise instead of perpetual dependence, of cultural preservation as the foundation rather than the afterthought of development. This is beautiful dreaming, Minister Ouedraogo said finally, but dreams don't stop bulldozers. No, Amara replied, but international law might. Environmental protection might. Cultural preservation rights might. And most importantly, economic alternatives might. The next morning, Amara stood before the assembled international media with a document that would shake the foundations of African development policy. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, I present the Ouagadougou Declaration, a new model for African development based on sovereignty, sustainability, and cultural preservation. The declaration, drafted overnight by some of Africa's finest minds, was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of accepting foreign development packages, participating African nations would form a continental development cooperative. Each nation would contribute according to its strengths: Nigeria's oil revenues, South Africa's mining expertise, Morocco's renewable energy technology, Ghana's financial stability, Kenya's agricultural innovation. The railway that threatens our burial ground, Amara continued, will be replaced by an African continental railway, designed by African engineers, financed by African resources and serving African trade routes. The solar farm that displaces our villages will be replaced by community-owned renewable energy cooperatives that keep ownership and profits in local hands. Dr. Muller stood up in the crowd of journalists. Ms. Kaboré, this is completely unrealistic. You're talking about restructuring the entire economic relationship between Africa and the developed world. Yes, Amara replied simply. We are. The boldness of it took everyone's breath away. For decades, African leaders had accepted that development meant dependence, that modernization required cultural sacrifice, that progress was something that happened to them rather than something they controlled. But the technical expertise? Chinwe protested. Africa has more university graduates than ever before in history, Professor Al-Rashid interjected. We have engineers, economists, scientists, and cultural experts. What we haven't had is the political will to trust our own capabilities. The capital requirements. Africa sends more money out in resource extraction profits than it receives in development aid, Dr. Mensah added. We're not poor. We're being systematically impoverished. The international reaction was swift and predictable. The World Bank expressed serious concerns about the proposal's unrealistic expectations and potential for economic instability. The IMF warned about the dangers of isolationist policies in a globally interconnected economy. But other voices were rising too. University students across Africa organized solidarity demonstrations. The African Union called an emergency session to discuss the declaration. Social media exploded with support from the diaspora. African descendants around the world who saw in this moment a chance for their ancestral continent to finally control its own destiny. Most importantly, several African heads of state began making cautious statements of support. The president of Ghana spoke of the need for African solutions to African challenges. The president of Senegal called for serious consideration of alternative development models. Even traditionally conservative leaders began questioning whether the old patterns of dependency were truly in their nation's best interests. The burial ground remained occupied. What had started as a cultural preservation protest had become the symbol of continental awakening. People brought food, water, and medical supplies to support the demonstrators. Traditional musicians performed concerts that were live-streamed around the world. Children came to learn the songs and stories that the development projects would have erased. But the pressure was mounting. Foreign investors threatened to withdraw from not just Burkina Faso but other African markets. Credit ratings agencies warned of potential downgrades. The veiled threats of economic warfare hung in the air like smoke from distant fires. "They're going to try to break us," Minister Ouedraogo warned Amara as they walked through the demonstration site a week after the Ouagadougou Declaration had been announced. Economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, maybe even more direct interventions. Amara nodded, feeling the weight of what they had set in motion. "Grandmama told me about the drought of 1973, she said. "The rains failed for 3 years. People said the old ways of farming wouldn't work anymore, that we needed foreign aid and foreign seeds and foreign expertise to survive." What happened? The elders gathered in the village and said, "We have survived droughts before. Our ancestors knew how to read the sky, how to save seeds, how to find water where others saw only dust. We will remember what we know and we will survive." Amara smiled, thinking of her grandmother's weathered hands demonstrating the techniques passed down through generations. And they did. The rains came back, and the people who had kept their traditional knowledge were the ones who prospered. "This is different, Amara. We're not talking about one village, one drought. We're talking about reshaping the entire economic relationship between Africa and the world." "Yes," she replied. "We are." That afternoon brought the first test. The European Union announced that it was reviewing its trade relationships with countries that had endorsed the Ouagadougou Declaration. Chinese investments in several African nations were suddenly placed under evaluation. The World Bank froze development loans to 3 West African countries. The pressure was designed to create cracks in the alliance, to make individual nations choose between solidarity and immediate economic relief. Some wavered. The president of one small nation announced that while he respected the principles of the declaration, his country could not risk economic isolation. Another leader called for further study of the proposals, diplomatic language for backing away. But others held firm. Nigeria's president surprised everyone by announcing that his country would redirect its oil revenues toward the proposed African Development Cooperative. South Africa committed its mining expertise to African-controlled projects. Morocco offered its renewable energy technology to the continental effort. On the 10th night of the occupation, something extraordinary happened. Amara's grandmother, now 93 years old and rarely able to leave her home, arrived at the burial ground carried in a chair by her grandsons. "The ancestors have been speaking," she announced, her voice somehow carrying across the hundreds of people gathered in the sacred space. "They tell me of a great crossroads, a moment when the children of Africa must choose between 2 futures." The crowd fell silent. Even the international journalists stopped their reporting to listen to the ancient woman whose presence seemed to fill the space like moonlight. "They show me a vision," she continued, her eyes closed, her voice taking on the rhythm of prophecy. "I see iron roads crossing our continent, but they are not the iron roads of strangers. They are built by our children, for our children, connecting our cities and carrying our dreams. I see great schools where our languages are spoken, our stories told, our wisdom preserved alongside new knowledge. I see hospitals built not to make profits for foreign companies, but to heal our people. I see fields green with food to feed our families, not cash crops to enrich distant masters." Her voice grew stronger as if the spirits themselves were speaking through her. "But I also see the other path. I see our children speaking only the languages of strangers, worshipping only the gods of money, knowing nothing of the wisdom that carried us through centuries of struggle. I see our land stripped bare, our resources stolen, our dignity sold for promises that turn to dust." She opened her eyes and looked directly at Amara. "The ancestors say the choice is ours. They cannot make it for us. But they will give us strength for whichever path we choose." The next morning brought news that would change everything. A consortium of African banks had announced their willingness to finance the first phase of the African Continental Railway, without foreign investment or control. African engineering firms from Nigeria, South Africa, and Morocco had formed a joint venture to design and build the system. Most importantly, the route had been redesigned to avoid all sacred sites while still connecting major economic centers. "It's impossible," Dr. Muller protested at an emergency meeting in the ministry. "You don't have the technical expertise, the financial resources, the project management experience." "We built the pyramids," Amara interrupted quietly. "We built Timbuktu, Great Zimbabwe, the Kingdom of Kush. We created mathematical systems, architectural marvels, trade networks that spanned continents. What we lack is not capability, it's confidence in our own capabilities." Chen Wei spread his hands diplomatically. "Miss Kaboré, even if you could build one railway, you're talking about 25 major infrastructure projects. The scale is unprecedented." "For us, yes. But not for Africa." Amara stood and walked to the window, looking out at the burial ground where her people continued their vigil. "Individually, our nations are small markets, limited resources, developing economies. But together? Together we are 1 billion people, vast natural resources, growing technological capabilities, and most importantly, the motivation to control our own destiny." The foreign advisors exchanged glances. This was not going according to their carefully laid plans. "The offer remains on the table," Dr. Muller said finally. "Modified terms, better cultural protections, increased local employment." "The offer is rejected," Amara replied. "All 25 projects, all foreign-controlled development packages, all attempts to mortgage our future for short-term gains. And if your alternative fails? If the African Development Cooperative can't deliver what it promises?" Amara turned from the window to face them. "Then we will have failed on our own terms, with our dignity intact, our culture preserved, and our children still knowing who they are. That is preferable to succeeding on your terms and losing our souls." 6 months later, Amara stood on the same ground where the occupation had begun, but everything had changed. The ancient burial ground remained undisturbed, now officially protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But around it, something unprecedented was taking shape. The Sankara Continental Trade Center rose from the red earth like a modern cathedral, its architecture blending traditional Sudano-Sahelian design with cutting-edge sustainable technology. Solar panels shaped like baobab leaves powered the facility, while rainwater collection systems built into the structure's organic curves would irrigate the surrounding gardens during the dry season. Inside, representatives from 37 African nations negotiated trade agreements, technology transfers, and cooperative development projects. The lingua franca was not English or French or Portuguese, but a mixture of African languages supported by real-time translation technology developed by African computer scientists. "The first phase of the Continental Railway begins construction next month," Musa told her as they watched engineers, African engineers, conducting final site surveys. "Nigeria to Ghana to Burkina Faso to Mali. Built by us, owned by us, serving our trade routes." Amara nodded, feeling the weight of her ancestors' silver bracelet on her wrist. The 7 cowrie shells caught the morning light like captured starlight. "And the other projects?" "The Kaya Community Solar Cooperative is already providing electricity to 12 villages, with profits shared among the residents. The Bobo Dioulasso Agricultural Technology Center is developing drought-resistant crops using traditional seed varieties enhanced with modern techniques. The Wahiguya Cultural University is teaching engineering in More, medicine in Diola, computer science in Fulfulde." Each project was smaller in scale than the original 25 megaprojects, but collectively they represented something far more significant. African solutions to African challenges, developed with African resources and controlled by African communities. "The foreign investors?" Amara asked. "Some have gone elsewhere looking for more compliant partners. Others have approached us about joint ventures on our terms, technology transfer, local ownership, cultural preservation as core requirements, not afterthoughts." The transformation hadn't been without costs. Several African nations had faced economic pressure, credit downgrades, and diplomatic isolation for supporting the Ouagadougou Declaration. But the solidarity had held, and alternative economic relationships had emerged. South-South trade, African continental markets, technology sharing between formerly colonized nations. The impact extended far beyond Burkina Faso. In Ghana, communities had rejected foreign mining companies and formed cooperative extractive industries that kept resource wealth in local hands. In Senegal, fishing communities had pooled resources to buy their own processing facilities instead of selling raw fish to European companies. In Kenya, software developers had created an African social media platform that celebrated local languages and cultures instead of imposing Western values. It's spreading, Dr. Asante told Amara during a video conference connecting development leaders across the continent. What started here in Burkina Faso has become a continental awakening. We're calling it the second liberation, not from colonial governments this time, but from economic colonialism. The screen showed faces from across Africa. Engineers in Lagos, economists in Johannesburg, cultural leaders in Addis Ababa, all connected by fiber optic cables owned and controlled by African telecommunications cooperatives. The resistance to the Madagascar mining project succeeded last week, reported Dr. Rakoto from Antananarivo. The communities rejected the foreign consortium and are developing their own small-scale, sustainable extraction methods using traditional ecological knowledge. The East African Railway Cooperative signed agreements with 5 nations, added engineer Wanjiku from Nairobi. Fully African-financed, with routes designed to connect our cities to each other, not just our resources to foreign ports. Amara felt the profound weight of what they had unleashed. What had begun as a simple act of cultural preservation, refusing to let bulldozers desecrate an ancestral burial ground, had become a continental revolution in thinking about development, sovereignty, and dignity. That evening, the traditional council of elders met in the sacred grove for their monthly ceremony. But this gathering was different. Elders from across West Africa had traveled to Ouagadougou to participate in what they called the Great Remembering. For too long we have allowed others to define progress for us, said Elder Tiendra Biego, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent watching his culture eroded by foreign influences. They told us that to be modern, we must abandon our languages, our spiritual practices, our traditional knowledge. They told us that development meant becoming like them. But our ancestors were not primitive, added Elder Fatou Diarra, who had traveled from Mali. They built sophisticated trade networks, developed complex agricultural systems, created mathematical and astronomical knowledge that guided them across desert and savanna. They were not waiting for foreigners to bring them civilization, they were civilization. The circle of elders included representatives from the Masi, Fulfulde, Diola, Gurunsi, and Bissa peoples, ethnic groups whose territories had been divided by colonial borders but whose cultural connections transcended national boundaries. The young ones need to remember, said Elder Sorgo, gesturing toward Amara and the other younger participants. Not just the stories and songs but the confidence. The knowledge that we are capable of solving our own problems, building our own futures, defining our own success. An elder from Senegal, her face marked with traditional scarification, stood and began to sing in Wolof. Others joined in their own languages, creating a harmony that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The songs were old, work songs, praise songs, resistance songs that had sustained their peoples through slavery, colonization, and every attempt to break their spirits. As the night deepened, they shared stories from their various communities about small victories and quiet revolutions. A village in northern Ghana that had rejected a foreign water project and dug their own wells using traditional techniques combined with modern equipment. A women's cooperative in Niger that had developed drought-resistant millet varieties using seeds preserved by grandmothers and techniques learned from agricultural scientists at the new Pan-African universities. Each small victory is a thread, said Elder Diarra. Individually, threads are fragile. But woven together, they become cloth strong enough to wrap a continent. 3 years after the occupation of the burial ground, Amara found herself standing before a classroom of students at the Wahiguya Cultural University, the first institution of higher learning in Burkina Faso where courses were taught primarily in African languages. Who can tell me the traditional Moor word for development? She asked in Moor, then repeated the question in Diola and Fulfulde. A young woman raised her hand. There is no direct translation, Professor. Because development as the foreigners define it, linear progress toward a Western model, was not a concept our ancestors recognized. Excellent, Salamata. Then how did our ancestors think about progress? A young man from the back of the room answered in Diola, cyclical improvement. Like the seasons, times of planting, growing, harvesting, resting, then planting again. But each cycle could be better than the last if you learned from experience and preserved the best seeds. Amara smiled, feeling her grandmother's presence. These students, studying engineering in their mother tongues, learning computer programming through traditional pedagogical methods, developing business plans that incorporated communal decision-making processes, represented something unprecedented in modern African education. Today we're going to examine the case study of the Bobo Dioulasso Solar Cooperative, she continued, switching to French briefly before returning to more. Not just the technical aspects of solar energy distribution, but the social systems that make it work. How traditional concepts of communal ownership translated into modern energy cooperatives. How conflict resolution mechanisms from village councils adapted to manage technical disputes among engineers. The students took notes on tablets manufactured by the West African Electronics Cooperative, devices designed to function in high-heat, low-infrastructure environments and programmed to support African languages that major tech companies had ignored. After class, Salamata approached her. "Professor Kaboré, my grandmother says you're the one who stood against the railway that would have destroyed the ancestral grounds. Is that true?" "Many people stood," Amara replied. "I was just one voice in a chorus. But you could have taken their job, their money, their promises of development. Why didn't you?" Amara thought of her grandmother's words about Princess Yanenga, about choices that echo through generations. Because some things are more valuable than money. And sometimes the only way to get what you really need is to refuse what others want to give you. But the path had not been smooth. The economic pressures were real and ongoing. Several African nations had struggled with the transition from foreign-dependent development to self-reliant growth. Currency fluctuations, reduced access to international credit markets, and the learning curve of managing complex projects without foreign expertise had created genuine hardships. In her office at the Cultural Ministry, now renamed the Ministry of Indigenous Development, Amara reviewed reports that painted a mixed picture. Unemployment had initially risen in sectors dependent on foreign investment. Some infrastructure projects had experienced delays and cost overruns as African teams learned through trial and error. International credit ratings for several participating nations had suffered. "The critics have ammunition," Minister Ouedraogo told her during their weekly strategy meeting. "GDP growth has slowed in the short term. Foreign direct investment has dropped significantly. The opposition parties are calling the Ouagadougou Declaration an economic disaster." "And what do you think?" Amara asked. The minister, now in his 60s, looked older but somehow more alive than he had during the dark days of forced foreign development. "I think we're learning to walk after decades of being carried. Walking is harder than being carried, but it's also the only way to choose your own destination. The challenges were real, but so were the victories." Burkina Faso's food security had improved dramatically as agricultural cooperatives focused on local food production instead of export crops. Health outcomes were rising as community-controlled health centers emphasized preventive care and traditional medicine alongside modern medical techniques. Educational enrollment was up as schools began teaching in mother tongues, making learning more accessible to rural children. "The question," Amara mused, "is not whether we're developing faster or slower than we would have under the old system. The question is whether we're developing into something we want to become." The global reaction to the African awakening, as international media had dubbed the movement, continued to evolve. Initial hostility from former colonial powers and international financial institutions had given way to grudging recognition that the movement was not going to simply collapse. Some Western nations began approaching African countries with genuinely partnership-based proposals. Technology sharing instead of technology dependence, joint ventures with African ownership instead of extractive investments, cultural exchange programs that celebrated African knowledge traditions instead of trying to replace them. "They're adapting," Dr. Muller admitted during a conference on African development held in Accra. He was still representing German development interests, but his tone had changed significantly. The old model of development aid and foreign direct investment assumed that African nations would remain junior partners indefinitely. That assumption is no longer tenable. The Chinese response had been more nuanced. While some Chinese companies had withdrawn from African markets rather than accept partnership terms instead of controlling positions, others had embraced the new paradigm. Several Sino-Africa joint ventures were thriving under arrangements that included technology transfer, local ownership stakes, and cultural preservation requirements. The Chinese have experienced being recipients of unfair international economic arrangements, Chinwei had explained during negotiations for a modified railway project. Perhaps this gives us a better understanding of African concerns than our Western counterparts. But the most significant change was happening between African nations themselves. The continental free trade area had evolved from a bureaucratic economic agreement into a living network of cultural and economic exchange. Universities shared faculty and research programs. Artists collaborated across borders. Businesses formed Pan-African cooperatives that leveraged the continent's collective market power. "We're remembering that we are one people divided by artificial borders," Dr. Mensah observed during a gathering of African economists in Lagos. "The colonial powers divided us to weaken us. Economic independence is helping us rediscover our fundamental unity." For Amara personally, the transformation had come with significant sacrifices. Her relationship with Marcus, a French development consultant she had been seeing before the crisis, had ended when he couldn't understand her refusal to be pragmatic about the development projects. "You're choosing ideology over reality," he had said during their final argument. "These projects would have brought real benefits to real people, and you've condemned them to continued poverty for the sake of abstract principles." "And you're choosing money over dignity," she had replied. "You see poverty and think the only solution is to become dependent on others. I see poverty and think the solution is to develop our own capabilities." The personal attacks had been vicious. International media had painted her as a development extremist and economic nationalist. Social media trolls had questioned her education, her motives, her right to speak for Burkina Faso. Death threats from unknown sources had forced her to accept government security protection. But support had come from unexpected quarters. African women across the continent had embraced her as a symbol of resistance to patriarchal development models that ignored women's knowledge and excluded them from decision-making. Young Africans studying abroad had organized solidarity rallies in London, Paris, New York, and Beijing. Even some development professionals from former colonial powers had privately expressed support for her positions. "You've become a symbol," Musa told her during one of their walks through the sacred grove. "That's dangerous, but it's also powerful." "I don't want to be a symbol," Amara replied. "I want to be a person living in a country that controls its own destiny." "Maybe that's what makes you a good symbol." 5 years after the original confrontation, Amara's grandmother Noaga passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by 4 generations of family. Her funeral became a celebration not just of her life, but of the cultural renaissance she had helped inspire. Thousands of people attended, including heads of state from across Africa, traditional leaders, artists, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by the movement she had nurtured. The ceremony lasted 3 days, incorporating traditional Mossi funeral rites with contributions from dozens of ethnic groups across West Africa. "She lived to see her great-granddaughter speak more to university students studying engineering," Amara said during the eulogy. "She lived to see African railways designed by African engineers, African hospitals built by African architects, African schools teaching African children in African languages. She lived to see us remember who we are." But Noaga's most powerful legacy was embedded in the institutions that had grown from the movement she had inspired. The Noaga Institute for Indigenous Knowledge became a leading center for research that combined traditional wisdom with modern scientific methods. The Ancestral Heritage Foundation protected sacred sites across West Africa while promoting cultural tourism that benefited local communities. Most importantly, the principles she had articulated, that dignity was not negotiable, that development must respect cultural values, that communities must control their own destinies, had become foundational to African development policy. During the funeral ceremony, elders from across the continent shared memories and wisdom that Noaga had preserved and transmitted. They spoke of her role in maintaining traditional ecological knowledge during decades when such wisdom was dismissed as primitive superstition. They remembered her insistence that African languages were vehicles for sophisticated thought, not obstacles to progress. "She carried the wisdom of 7 generations," said Elder Tiendra Biego. "Now we must carry it forward to the next 7. By the 10th anniversary of the Ouagadougou Declaration, the ripple effects had spread far beyond Africa. Indigenous communities in Latin America had adapted the African model to resist extractive industries that threatened their lands and cultures. Pacific Island nations had formed cooperatives to develop climate adaptation technologies that respected traditional ecological knowledge. Even some marginalized communities in wealthy countries had drawn inspiration from the African example of cultural preservation combined with economic self-determination. "The African Renaissance has become a global indigenous renaissance," observed Dr. Kawena Charlo Veoga, a Maori development economist from New Zealand, during a conference on alternative development models. "Indigenous communities worldwide are realizing that they don't have to choose between cultural preservation and economic progress. They can have both if they control the development process themselves." The success of African-controlled development had also begun influencing mainstream development thinking. The World Bank had launched an Indigenous Development Initiative, that emphasized community control and cultural preservation. The UN had created new guidelines for development projects that required meaningful consultation with affected communities and respect for traditional knowledge systems. We're seeing a paradigm shift in how development is conceptualized globally, noted Professor Elena Rodriguez from the Universidad de São Paulo. The old top-down, one-size-fits-all approach is giving way to recognition that sustainable development must be culturally appropriate and community-controlled. But perhaps the most significant impact was on how Africans saw themselves. A generation of young people had grown up believing that African solutions to African problems were not just possible but preferable. They spoke their mother tongues with pride, studied their cultural traditions as sources of practical wisdom, and approached global challenges with confidence in their own capabilities. We have children who believe that being African is an advantage, not a disadvantage, Amara reflected during an interview with a Pan-African media collective. They see our diversity as strength, our traditions as resources, our independence as normal. That psychological transformation may be more important than any infrastructure project. Standing once again in the sacred grove where the movement had crystallized 15 years earlier, Amara watched her 5-year-old niece, Yanenga, playing with children from across West Africa who were visiting for the annual Festival of African Renaissance. The children switched effortlessly between languages, sang songs that blended traditional melodies with contemporary rhythms, and played games that incorporated both ancient wisdom and modern technology. The baobab trees that had witnessed centuries of change now presided over a transformed landscape. The Sankara Continental Trade Center hummed with activity as African businesses conducted trade in African languages using African banking systems. The Ouagadougou Institute of Technology graduated engineers who designed infrastructure adapted to African environments and cultural needs. The sacred grove itself had become a pilgrimage site for Africans and people of African descent from around the world who came to connect with ancestral wisdom and contemporary innovation. Auntie Amara, little Yanenga called out in more, Grandmama Noaga's spirit is here, isn't she? Amara knelt beside her niece, feeling the weight of her ancestors' silver bracelet and the responsibility of carrying wisdom forward. How do you know? Because the trees are singing, the child replied matter-of-factly. And the songs are happy. Amara listened and indeed heard something, not supernatural voices, but the sound of a continent that had found its own voice. Construction crews singing traditional work songs as they built African-designed infrastructure. University students debating development policy in indigenous languages. Market women conducting business using mobile banking systems that incorporated traditional trust networks. The 25 massive foreign-controlled projects that had once threatened to transform Burkina Faso into a dependency had been replaced by hundreds of smaller, community-controlled initiatives that were transforming Africa into something unprecedented, a modern civilization that honored its ancient wisdom. Yes, she told her niece, Grandmama's spirit is here. And she's proud of what we've built. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in colors that matched the traditional textiles worn by people celebrating in the streets below, Amara felt the presence of all 7 generations, those who had preserved the wisdom that made this moment possible, and those yet to come who would carry it forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. The iron roads that now crossed Burkina Faso carried more than goods and passengers. They carried dreams, dignity, and the revolutionary idea that African people could control their own destiny while honoring the wisdom of their ancestors. In resisting the bulldozers that would have destroyed a burial ground, they had awakened something far more powerful. The knowledge that they were the descendants of civilizations that had thrived for millennia and could thrive again. The baobab had not fallen. Instead, it had grown new branches that stretched toward a sky filled with infinite possibilities. When the children remember their names, even the ancestors dance. New More proverb. 20 years later, the Museum of African Renaissance in Ouagadougou displays artifacts from the transformation period. Protest signs written in indigenous languages, traditional tools adapted for modern infrastructure projects, photographs of the first African Continental Railway construction teams, and recordings of the songs that sustained the movement. But the most treasured exhibit is a simple display case containing 7 cowrie shells on a silver bracelet, with a placard that reads, "Given by Amara Kaboré to her granddaughter Amara." 7 shells representing 7 generations of wisdom. Worn during the resistance that reminded Africa of its power. Visitors, African and international, often spend long moments in front of this display, understanding that they are looking at more than jewelry. They are seeing the physical embodiment of cultural continuity, the tangible link between ancestral wisdom and contemporary achievement. And in the schools of Burkina Faso, Children still learn the songs their great-grandmothers sang, speak the languages their ancestors preserved, and dream dreams that honor both their heritage and their limitless future. The revolution that began with a refusal to let bulldozers destroy a burial ground had become something eternal. The knowledge that dignity, preserved and defended, becomes the foundation upon which free peoples build their own tomorrows.